In one afternoon, in one hotel room in New York City, 5 men signed a piece of paper that did more damage to Japan than any bomb could have. No soldiers, no sanctions, no headlines screaming about an attack, just a signature. And 30 years later, Japan still hasn't fully recovered. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's not a conspiracy theory. It's not clickbait. It's just history that almost nobody was ever taught. In September of 1985, the world's most powerful economies quietly agreed to change the value of money itself. And in doing so, they broke the back of the second largest economy on Earth without firing a single shot. And here's the part that should really unsettle you. Japan sat right there at that table and agreed to it. They walked into their own trap willingly. Once you understand how this machine actually works, you'll start noticing the exact same playbook being run today in a different country with the same tools, and almost nobody watching will see it coming. I've spent my life studying how economies rise and fall, and this is one of the cleanest examples in modern history of a war won without a single bullet. So let's break down exactly what happened, why it happened, and what it means for your money right now. Before I go further, I need you to do one thing for me, because what I'm about to explain took me years to piece together, and I'm giving it to you in the next 20 minutes for free. Most people pay consultants and read 300-page books to understand this. So if you're serious about protecting your money and understanding how the world actually works, hit subscribe right now before you forget, because this channel is going to keep handing you these lessons, and you don't want to miss the next one. Let's go back to the early 1980s, because you can't understand the crash without understanding the setup. America had a problem, a big one. The US dollar was too strong. Now that sounds like a good thing, right? A strong currency, a strong country, but it's not that simple. And this is one of those things that trips people up all the time. When your currency gets too strong, your exports become expensive for everyone else. Nobody wants to buy your cars or your electronics or your steel because it costs too much. Meanwhile, everyone else's stuff looks cheap to you, so you buy it instead. That's exactly what was happening to America. Japanese cars, Japanese electronics, Japanese everything was flooding into the United States, and American factories were getting crushed. Detroit was bleeding jobs. Farmers couldn't sell their crops overseas. The trade deficit was ballooning to numbers nobody had ever seen before, something like $120 billion, which back then was an enormous figure. And when a country starts losing jobs and losing industries, politicians start looking for someone to blame. They always do. It's human nature. It's the nature of the economic machine. When people are struggling, they want someone to point a finger at. And in this case, that someone was Japan. I want you to understand just how strong the dollar has gotten, because the scale of it is what made this such a serious problem. From 1980 to 1985, the dollar had climbed roughly 50% against a basket of major world currencies. That's not a small move. That's a massive, almost violent shift in 5 years. And when your currency moves that much, that fast, it doesn't just affect big corporations and Wall Street traders. It affects the guy running an auto parts factory in Ohio, the farmer trying to sell wheat overseas, the small manufacturer who suddenly can't compete on price anymore. Entire towns built around single industries started hollowing out. And when enough of those towns start hurting at the same time, that pain shows up in Washington, D.C. in the form of real political pressure. Threats of tariffs, threats of trade restrictions, the kind of thing that can genuinely spiral into a full-blown trade war if left unaddressed. So the U.S. had two options. Option one, put up trade barriers, slap tariffs on Japanese goods, start a real trade war. That's messy, that's public, that invites retaliation, and it can spiral out of control fast. Option two, and this is the quiet, elegant, almost invisible option, you change the value of money itself. If you can make the yen more expensive and the dollar cheaper, Japanese goods become expensive automatically without a single tariff, without a single angry headline about trade wars. You don't need to fight the war in public. You just change the rules of the game underneath everyone's feet. And that's exactly what they chose to do. On September 22nd, 1985, the finance ministers and central bank heads of the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and Britain met at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. This became known as the Plaza Accord. And here's what makes this moment so important to understand. This wasn't some secret backroom conspiracy where Japan was tricked. Japan agreed to this. They sat at the table and signed on. Why would they do that to themselves? Because Japan was worried about a trade war too, and because there was real pressure, real fear that if they didn't cooperate, things could get much worse for them politically and economically. So the five countries agreed to work together to push the dollar down and push the yen up. They agreed to sell dollars and buy yen in the currency markets, all at the same time, all together, to force the exchange rate to move in a direction it might not have moved on its own. This is the part I want you to really understand, because it's the core lesson here. Money is not neutral. It is a tool, and in the hands of powerful countries, it can be used as a weapon just as effectively as any army. Think about it this way. If I want to hurt your business, I can either send police to shut your doors, which everyone will see and everyone will be angry about, or I can quietly change the value of the currency you price your products in. So your products become too expensive for anyone to want to buy. And I never have to lift a finger publicly. One of those methods gets you condemned on the world stage. The other one barely makes the front page. Smart, powerful countries almost always choose the second option because it's undeniable, it's technical. And by the time regular people understand what happened, the damage is already done. Now watch what happened next, because this is where the trap really tightens. Before the Plaza Accord, it took about 240 yen to buy $1. Within about 2 years, it took only about 150 yen to buy that same dollar. By 1988, it was down near 120. Think about what that means in plain terms. The yen basically doubled in value against the dollar in a very short period of time. If you're a Japanese company selling cars to America, your products just become dramatically more expensive overseas, seemingly overnight, through no fault of your own manufacturing or your own pricing decisions. Toyota, Sony, Panasonic, all of Japan's export machines, the very engine that had made Japan an economic miracle for 3 decades, suddenly got hit with a wall. Growth slowed hard. In 1985, Japan's economy was growing at about 5%. By 1986, that had dropped to around 3%. They even had a name for it at the time. the Endaka recession, which just means the strong yen recession. And here's the thing about pain like this in an economic system: when a country feels this kind of pressure, it doesn't just sit there and take it, it reacts. And how a country reacts to pain is often more important than the pain itself. This is one of the most important principles I've learned studying economic history across dozens of countries and hundreds of years. It is almost never the initial shock that destroys an economy. It's the response to the shock: a currency move, a supply disruption, a market drop. These things happen to every economy eventually. It's simply part of the cycle. What separates a country that recovers in a year or two from a country that loses an entire generation of growth is almost always the decisions made in the months right after the shock hits. This is where Japan made the decision that would define the next 30 years of its history. And it's a decision I've seen countries make over and over again throughout history, because it feels like the obvious solution at the moment, even though it's actually planting a bomb to fight off the pain from the strong yen. The Bank of Japan did what almost every central bank does when growth slows down. They cut interest rates again and again. They made borrowing money incredibly cheap, hoping that Japanese companies and consumers would spend more at home to make up for the export losses abroad. On paper, this makes sense. If you can't sell as much overseas, sell more domestically. And cheap money encourages people to build, buy, and invest. But here's what they didn't fully appreciate, and this is a mistake I've watched play out in country after country. Cheap money doesn't just flow into productive investment, it flows into speculation. When you make borrowing essentially free, people don't just build new factories, they start buying assets, hoping those assets go up in price. Real estate, stocks, land, anything that can appreciate becomes a magnet for all that cheap credit. And that's exactly what happened in Japan. The Japanese stock market took off like a rocket. The Nikkei index, which is basically Japan's version of the Dow Jones, quadrupled in value in just a few years. But the real estate boom was even more insane. And this is the part that people find hard to believe until they see the actual numbers. At the peak of the bubble, the land underneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, just that one small plot of land, was estimated to be worth more than the entire state of California. Let that sink in. One garden in one city was theoretically worth more than an entire American state, with 40 million people in the fifth largest economy on the planet. Golf club memberships, and I know this sounds absurd, were trading like stocks, some of them worth hundreds of thousands of dollars just to join a club. Banks were lending against inflated land values, then using the rising value of that land as collateral to lend even more. And this created a feedback loop where everyone believed prices could only go up. This is what I call a classic bubble mentality. When people stop investing in something because of its actual value and start investing in it purely because they believe someone else will pay more for it later, it always feels rational in the moment because everyone around you believes it too, and that collective belief becomes its own kind of proof right up until it isn't. I've studied bubbles in Holland with tulips, in America with dot-com stocks, in the U.S. housing market before 2008, and they all follow the same basic emotional arc, even though the asset is completely different every time. First, prices rise for a legitimate reason, some real improvement in the economy or the technology or the policy environment. then more people notice the prices rising and jump in, not because they understand the underlying value, but because they don't want to miss out. Then lending gets looser because banks want a piece of the action too, and cheap credit pours gasoline on the fire. Then prices become completely disconnected from anything real. Land worth more than entire countries. Companies worth more than their entire industries combined. And still people keep buying because the story everyone tells themselves is that this time is different. It never is. Japan in the late 1980s is one of the purest examples of this pattern in the historical record, precisely because the disconnection from reality was so extreme and so well documented. Now here's where the second half of the trap closes, because a bubble like this cannot last forever, and eventually, the people running the system know it. By late 1989, Japanese policymakers finally realized how dangerous this bubble had become. So the Bank of Japan did the opposite of what they'd done a few years earlier. They started raising interest rates aggressively to try to cool things down before it got even more out of control. And this is one of the hardest things to do in economics because timing this perfectly is nearly impossible. You either act too early and choke off real growth, or you act too late and the bubble has grown so large that popping it causes massive damage. Japan acted too late. In 1990, the stock market started collapsing. The Nikkei lost close to 40% of its value within a single year, and it kept falling from there. Real estate prices followed right behind it, crashing for years, in some cases decades. Banks that had lent huge sums of money against inflated land values were suddenly holding loans that were worth far more than the actual collateral backing them. This created what's called a mountain of bad debt sitting inside the banking system. And Japan spent years, really decades, refusing to fully deal with it, letting weak banks and weak companies limp along instead of forcing the painful restructuring that needed to happen. Economists later gave this era a name. They called it the lost decade. But honestly, that name undersells it because it turned into the lost 2 decades. And in some ways, Japan still hasn't fully recovered even today. Their stock market didn't return to its 1,989 peak for over 30 years. Wages stayed flat for a generation. An entire generation of young Japanese workers grew up in an economy that barely grew at all, while their parents had grown up in one of the greatest economic miracles in modern history. There's a term economists use for what happened inside Japan's banking system during this period. They call it zombie companies and zombie banks. These were businesses and lenders that, in a healthy system, should have failed outright, gone through bankruptcy, been restructured, and let the resources tied up in them flow to more productive parts of the economy. Instead, Japan kept them alive artificially for years through cheap loans and quiet government support, because letting them fail all at once felt too painful, too disruptive, too politically dangerous. But here's the thing about zombie companies. They don't actually help anyone in the long run. They tie up capital, labor, and land in businesses that aren't creating real growth, which starves the healthy, innovative parts of the economy of the resources they need to expand. It's a bit like refusing to remove a splinter because pulling it out hurts. So instead, you just let the wound sit there, slowly getting infected for years. So let's step back and ask the real question. the one that actually matters to you watching this right now. Was this really done on purpose? I think the honest answer is more nuanced than a simple yes or no, and understanding that nuance is the whole point. The Plaza Accord itself was absolutely done on purpose. That part isn't a theory, it's documented history. 5 governments sat in a room and agreed to weaken the dollar and strengthen the yen, specifically to hurt Japan's export advantage and protect American industry. That was a deliberate, calculated economic strategy, and it worked exactly as intended in that narrow sense. But what happened after that, the bubble, the crash, the lost decades, that part was Japan's own policy response spiraling out of control. Nobody forced the Bank of Japan to keep interest rates that low for that long. Nobody forced Japanese banks to lend so recklessly against land prices that it disconnected from reality. In a way, the outside pressure lit the match, but Japan poured the gasoline on itself. And I think that's actually the more important lesson here, because it applies far beyond Japan. Outside forces can absolutely pressure you. They can absolutely try to weaken you. And sometimes they succeed at that first move. But how you respond to that pressure determines whether you experience a temporary setback or a multi-decade collapse. Japan didn't just get hit. Japan overreacted to being hit. And that overreaction is what turned a currency adjustment into one of the biggest economic collapses of the modern era. Now, here's why I'm telling you all of this and why this matters to you sitting there watching this video today, wherever you are in the world. This exact same playbook has been run before, and it will be run again, because currency pressure is one of the most powerful and least understood tools that big countries use against each other. Right now, there is enormous pressure building around global trade imbalances again, just like there was in the early 1980s. Big countries with massive trade surpluses, currencies that some argue are undervalued, tension building around tariffs and manufacturing and jobs. It all rhymes with what happened before Plaza. I'm not telling you exactly which country or when, because frankly, nobody can predict that with certainty. And anyone who tells you they know exactly how it'll play out is selling you something. Here's something else worth understanding, because it changes how you should think about this. Big economic cycles like the one Japan went through don't move in straight lines, and they don't happen in isolation. They're connected to a much bigger cycle, the rise and fall of reserve currencies and dominant world powers, something I've studied and written about extensively. Great powers tend to rise on the back of strong manufacturing, strong exports, and a growing share of world trade, just like Japan did from the 1950s through the 1980s, and just like other rising powers have done since. But that rise inevitably creates friction with the existing dominant power, because trade and manufacturing dominance is never unlimited. Someone else's gain often looks to the country losing ground like a threat that has to be addressed. Currency pressure is one of the primary tools used in that friction, precisely because it's slower and quieter than tariffs or military pressure, but it can be just as effective, sometimes more effective, at rebalancing the scales. What I am telling you is this: understand the mechanism. Understand that when a country's currency suddenly strengthens dramatically, that's not just a headline on a financial news channel that ripples through real economies, real jobs, real companies, and eventually, if handled badly, it can ripple into your own portfolio and your own paycheck, no matter where you live. And understand that the real danger usually isn't the first shock. It's the panicked policy response that follows it, central banks flooding the system with cheap money to numb the pain, governments encouraging people to borrow and spend to paper over a structural problem. That is the pattern that turns a manageable adjustment into a generational collapse. If you want to protect yourself, the lesson isn't to predict exactly which country gets hit next. The lesson is to never let yourself be the person caught holding assets that only make sense if prices go up forever. Diversify across countries, across currencies, across asset types, because when the machine turns on one economy, being tied entirely to that one economy is one of the most dangerous positions you can be in. So here's my challenge to you. I want you to go look at your own portfolio, your own savings, your own financial life, and ask yourself honestly, am I too concentrated in one currency, one country, one type of asset that only wins if the good times keep rolling forever, the way Japan did in the 1980s? Most people never ask that question until it's too late, until the crash has already happened and they're staring at losses instead of preparing for them. Don't be like most people. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. And the rhyme between what happened to Japan and what's brewing in the world economy right now is loud enough that you should be paying attention. If this video helped connect the dots for you, make sure you're subscribed, because I'm going to keep pulling back the curtain on how this machine actually works. The parts nobody teaches you in school, the parts that actually determine whether your money grows or gets wiped out. Drop a comment and tell me which country you think is facing this kind of pressure right now. I read every single one, and I might make the next video about exactly the country you name. Stay sharp, stay diversified, and I'll see you in the next one.